Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to draw a lion cub in pastels. Now this follows on from last week's tutorial where I did upload the background section, so if you would like to see how I did that all with pan pastels, then I will link that in the description below. Now like with all subjects, I will always start off with the eye first. Now this portrait wasn't overly big, it was an 8x12 size portrait, and I wanted to make sure that I could show in the Patreon tutorial that you can still fit a really good amount of detail when you're working on a smaller scale. Now of course, because this is going to feature the entire body of the lion cub, that's therefore going to make the eyes smaller. But I still can indicate at a really nice photorealism level of detail here by making sure I've got my contrasts right. You can see that the dark around the eye is really dark, and I've made sure that the highlights at the top part of the eye are nice and bright. This is going to help to build up the shape of the eye. Now once I've got the eyes complete and I'm happy with those, I then feel I can move on to the next part of the portrait. That there is mapping in my base layer. Now I like working in really small sections. For me, I find I'm a lot more effective with the way that I work. I do find that I spend less time hesitating, looking at that reference photo, thinking where exactly should I be working, because I'm only focusing on a couple of square inches at one time. Now my main aim throughout the layering process is I wanted to make sure that I captured the softness in the fur. Lion cubs, like any young animal, they seem to have a little bit more of that softer fur texture, so I really wanted to make sure that I got that right. Now as you can see here, at times I've got things in the view of the camera where I'm explaining things such as the pressure that should be applied on the pencil, the way that you can blend those pencils, the specific colours that you want to be using. All of this was explained at the time of drawing, because all of this tutorial is available on my Patreon channel as a full-length tutorial from start to finish. You get the reference photo, line art and full material list so that anybody who wants to follow along can do so. It's very step by step. So if my slower in-depth tutorials are of interest, I'll link my Patreon in the description below. So you can see here that my main aim of my pan pastel base layer is to get a really nice soft but smooth blended layer. You can still see my transfer lines through that pan pastel base, and that is really important. One of the common complaints that pan pastels can get is that they can feel the tooth of the paper early on, which really does limit how much detail you can fit on top. In some cases, you may feel like the pencils are gliding over that pan pastel base layer and they feel a little bit slick. That's a good indication that you've filled the tooth of the paper, and therefore there isn't any of that texture of the paper left for the pastels to grip onto. So you won't be able to put many details on top. So being able to see those transfer lines through your pan pastel base layer is a really good indication that you've got the right amount of pan pastel for that very first layer. So before I move on to some tips on how to use these pencils to create this kind of detail, if the tips and techniques that I've shared so far in this video have been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference. So onto the pencils themselves. Now in order to get this kind of detail when you're working on a smaller scale, if you compare the size of the head here to the pencils, it's not a large area. But by layering in a specific way, being a little bit more cautious, but more specifically focusing on lots of subtle layers, we're able to build up a nice amount of fur detail. Now the amount of pressure that you put on the pencil, where you hold the pencil and how you're actually using that pencil are all going to influence the type of detail that you create. So in some cases you'll see me holding it closer to the lead, while at others I'm holding it right at the opposite end, far away from that lead, and again that's also that I can create a different type of pencil stroke. With any fur texture that is soft or particularly fine, so if you've got really tiny details, you want limited and minimal pressure on that pastel pencil. The more pressure you apply to that pencil, the thicker your line will be. And again, this is something that I make sure to explain at every point in my Patreon tutorials, because the pressure is one of the most important factors. I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur. I'll link that in the description if that's of interest. But a few of the things that I talk about in there is the fur length, the fur direction and the fur thickness. Now again, all of this will be determined by the amount of pressure that's put on that pencil and how you hold that pencil. When we're new to drawing or painting, something that can be tricky early on is trying to get to grips with how long that fur should be on the area that we're working on. Now, one thing that can really help with that is if you print out your reference photo the same size as your artwork. It doesn't have to be printed in colour, a black and white copy is fine. Have that the same size as your artwork, and then you're going to be able to see how long and how thick each of that first set stroke should be in that section, because it's right there in front of you. If you work from a tablet, it can be harder to judge that, because obviously having that ability to zoom in, it's going to be harder to judge how long each pencil stroke should be. So printing out that reference photo is certainly something that can really help. And what you'll find is, by using this technique with printing that reference photo, that a couple of portraits down the line, you won't have to rely on that so much. You'll get a lot more confident with how long each pencil stroke should be. Now, a prime example of this is, for instance, here around the nose and the muzzle. This fur is going to be very short compared to anywhere else on the face. So I have to make sure that I am reducing the length of my pencil strokes by easing off on the pressure, so that I can really replicate the right type of fur texture. So once I've got the face pretty much done, that's when I move on to the body. Now, the Patreon tutorial has got over 10 hours of real-time footage, so there's no parts there that are left out. When I work on the base layer, again, just like with the face, I'm just making sure that I've got my smooth edges. I don't want any harsh start and stop points. This is particularly more important when I'm trying to draw a softer fur texture, because if you're working with more of a rigid and harsh base layer, it's a lot harder to get these seamless transitions as I'm creating now. Although I'm having to build up my pastel pencils on top of that base layer, I'm relying on the softness of that very first pan pastel base layer, which is all reinforcing the fur texture with these pencil details. And as you can see here, many pencils are being shown in the view of the camera so that I can really explain the colour selection. Now, colour selection is something that I think we all find a little overwhelming sometimes, especially if we're new to any colour-based medium. We put a lot of focus and emphasis on trying to match the exact colour to the reference photo, and I do show in all of my tutorials and pick the pencils that I think would be best suited for that, and I explain the reasons why. There are many different pencils that you can use to get to the same end. If you've seen many of my tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I focus on the contrast more than the exact colour. The main reason for this is, let's say you've got maybe your own pet, your own dog. You take 10 photographs of that animal and you can guarantee that every single one of them will show a slightly different colour. I've got a black and white Staffordshire Bull Terrier, and sometimes she looks like she's got some blues in her fur, while other times she's got some brown tones. So it really does depend on the environment, the light source, and where that photo was taken. So for me, I do want to make sure I get the colour of that fur as close as I can to the reference photo, and I do show how to do that in my Patreon tutorials. But more importantly for me, it's the contrast that I want to get right. I want to make sure that my highlights are accurate and that they're as bright as needed, and that my shadows are dark and as dark as what's required. That's what's going to make my portrait more realistic, rather than fixating on the exact colour. Now, something else you will also see here, that when I work on colourings like this and this type of fur texture, I do work from dark to light. There are occasions where I work the opposite and I put my light colours down first and I add my shadows on top. But most of the time, 90% of the time, I will work in the way that you can see here. So I've got a bit more of a darker base layer put in. I then add my darker pencils and my lighter pencils in the correct order. So if I see that there is a particularly tan patch, like what I'm working on here, you'll see that I'm layering my subtle colours on top first. I'm not jumping to my brightest highlights. And that layering process is going to be one of the best ways of achieving more realism and depth in any fur, regardless of the animal and regardless of the texture that we're drawing. So if you've seen the background part of this tutorial that I uploaded to YouTube last week, you'll know that I made quite a big error. So I left out all of this entire back leg. I don't know how I did it, but I carried on the background all the way up to the front leg and left this out. In the Patreon tutorial, I don't ever cut out any mistakes because it happens to everybody and it's an important part of the learning process. What I do show though in the Patreon tutorial is how to fix that. So I show you how to remove that pan pastel background in that one section where the leg should be, how I then transferred the correct shape of the leg on top, and then how I made sure that I put that tan and fur colour over the top without filling the tooth of the paper. Now I wasn't sure whether or not this was going to be possible at the time because I had put my background in over the top of where that leg should be. But this does just prove how versatile and forgiving pastels are. So if you would like to see how to fix such mistakes like that, and that was a big mistake. If you would like to see how to fix that, and it was very easily fixed, then all of that is in the Patreon tutorial. As I start to work more on the body here, you can really see how that fur direction is playing such an important role in determining the shape of this lion cub. Every single pencil stroke that I create has a curve to it, but it's the direction of that curve that I want to get right. That's going to be the same with down the front legs as well and on the paws. I'm going to have to shorten my pencil strokes here, especially on the toes, because obviously they don't have long hair on their feet, so I do have to make sure that I really study that photo, take in all that information and adjust my pencil strokes accordingly. Now something else that I've briefly mentioned here is also my lighting, the contrast. But now that we've got both front legs in, you can see that I've got a slight colour shift from one leg to the other. On the right hand side I've used a few more orange tones, it's a bit warmer, it looks a bit redder, whereas on the left hand side I'm using more of my yellows. This is deliberate because of the way that the light source was, it was coming a little bit more from the right hand side. Now because the sun it looked a bit like a sunlit glow on the reference photo, so therefore it's casting a lot of those warmer colours into the fur. So I want to make sure where possible, if I notice a colour shift, whether or not we've got a bit more of a warmer colour and a cooler colour, that I indicate at that. Noticing those colour changes, because it follows the light source, which again reinforces our contrasts, means that I want to make sure that I get all of those in, regardless if it's just a tiny variation. And that's why in this tutorial here you can see that I'm really explaining the pencils that I'm using. Now one thing that I also have in my recent tutorials up to a couple of months ago, and they will feature in every single tutorial from then on, is I have a palette cam in the corner of my Patreon tutorials so that members can see how I'm mixing my pan pastels, how I'm sharpening my pencils and that kind of thing. So all of that as well is shown at the time, because I now also do my voiceovers while I'm drawing, so every decision, every reason behind a pencil choice, a layer, is all explained. So these tiny little hairs that are on the toes, I needed to make sure that I overlapped those in the right way. Of course I want to make it look like the little lion cub is putting the pressure on the toes. That's what's making the fur and the toes position in the way that they are. I had to make sure that I built up my shadows and my highlights and also that fur direction to make the paws look natural. Now paws, toes, particularly cats' feet if you do pet portraits, they do have a tendency of looking a little bit strange if you get your lights and your darks wrong. They can look very two-dimensional and flat. So you do want to make sure that any subtle variation there is mapped in your base layer stage so that you can then reinforce that throughout your detailed layers. And as always, last up and the very last thing to go on my portrait are the whiskers. Because they overlap everything else, they need to be left until that last layer. So here is a photograph of my finished portrait. I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared here have been useful. If they were, as I've said, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference. If you'd like to get notified of all of the future content that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'm going to be uploading another video next week.